Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, everybody. This is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. In this introduction to the program, I'll do something unusual. I'll mention the subjects that I'll speak about, and I'll share with the listeners something very unusual, but I found it so interesting that I want to share it. As far as the items to be discussed, there are essentially two. One is a tribute to President Trump's Mideast policies, which were very successful. And the other item is the activities of B'Tselem, an Israeli organization that is anti-Israel. The unusual topics, which I'll mention now, it has to do with the control of the nuclear arsenal by the United States president, which is the following. There's something called the nuclear football, which is an oddly shaped 45-pound briefcase. It's always at the president's side to command and control the country's massive nuclear arsenal. A military aide carrying the football remains physically close to the president, ready to carry out a well-rehearsed choreography of command and control. Now, however, the outgoing president, for the first time, will not hand off the black leather case to the incoming president because the outgoing president, Trump, will be in Florida and the incoming president will be in Washington. So what will happen is the military aide will accompany Trump to Florida with one of these suitcases, and Trump will retain sole authority to launch a nuclear strike until 11:59 a.m. on Wednesday morning, which was yesterday. Trump's being physically out of Washington will not affect his launch authority or access to the football until noon. There are multiple footballs. Another officer, a military man, with a second nuclear football, will hand over the authority to Biden once he's sworn in. And that one will be held by an Army officer on the same platform with the incoming president. So at exactly noontime, the new president will get control of the nuclear arsenal, and I found that fascinating. I'll be back after the break.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to the Jay Shapiro Show.
Hi, you're back with Jay Shapiro. I have a number of interesting phenomena relating to my relatives in the United States and the Trump administration. For some reason or other, most of the people I know in the United States seem to hate Trump passionately. And I used to ask them, what is it about his policies that you don't like? And I never got a straight answer, which made them even more angry. They didn't like his personality. So I said to them, simply don't invite him to your house for dinner if you don't like him. What about his policies? So I want to say a few things about Trump's policies vis-a-vis the Middle East and Israel. It would be a colossal mistake for the incoming administration to throw away Trump's policies here in the Middle East. His policies have made the United States and Israel safer, and stronger. I want to give a short summary of the Trump administration's Mideast policy innovations and his accomplishment. First of all, the Trump team did a great service to the cause of long-term Israel-Palestinian and Israel-Arab peace by insisting and acting on basic historical truths that long had been distorted by all kind of professionals who kept talking about a peace process that didn't exist, and also the so-called international consensus. Keep in mind that Trump moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, recognizing that Jerusalem has been the capital of the Jewish people for thousands of years. We pray in the direction of Jerusalem, and it's been the capital of the modern state of Israel since its founding. It also was an affirmation that Jerusalem must never again be divided. Furthermore, the Pompeo Doctrine made it clear that Jews are not interlopers or illegal settlers in Judea and Samaria, but they are rather indigenous to the land of Israel. Trump's acceptance of Israeli sovereignty on the Golan Heights was also recognition of basic strategic and historical realities. That was a move that again serves to purify Mideast discourse from these unrealistic expectations that deny Israel secure borders. The Trump administration sought to nudge Palestinians toward replacement of their rejectionism with new attitudes and replacement of their leadership with men and women who seek peace and prosperity for their people in partnership with Israel. The Trump administration did so by treating Palestinians as adults, with no free pass regarding the type of government they establish. It did so by cutting corrupt Palestinian sinecures like funding for UNRWA UNRWA, which also keeps alive the destructive Palestinian expectation of refugee return to Israel. And it also cut back funding for the Palestinian Authority, which pays terrorists and their families for slaying Israelis, and which glorifies terrorism in its schools and its media. It closed the PL office in Washington, which was a source of venomous propaganda against Israel. And by the way, the new vice president of the United States promised an Arab crowd in Detroit during the campaign that she would reopen the PLO office in Washington. So you have to keep an eye on that. Most importantly, I think, the Trump Middle East Peace Plan, which was released last year, dismissed the unrealistic formula of the past 25 years for the endgame between Israel and the Palestinians, which was based on maximal Palestinian demands along minimal regard for Israel's security needs and also Israel's national historic claims. Despite the United Nations, the European Union, and all the other attempts to ignore the Trump outline for the future, its basic parameters will prevail over the long term, which I think includes eventually Israeli sovereignty over strategic sections of Judea and Samaria, including our eastern border, the Jordan Valley. That was held back now because of Israel's new relationship with the Arab Gulf states, and that's a story unto itself. In general, the plan issued by Trump is serious and detailed, and it's an effort to answer basic needs on both sides, which include Israeli security and rights, Palestinian prosperity and freedom, without reverting to massive human dislocation or risking radical Islamic victory. It's a pragmatic plan, and it jives with broad Israeli consensus. Another thing important is that Trump decided the United States would brook no more American charity for Iran, including Iran's vague commitments under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action as an agreement negotiated by Obama and the so-called P5+1. Trump withdrew America from a sloppy and dangerous deal like that, making the point that the dates that are called sunsets, when Iran could again increase its nuclear capability, and it assumed that the whole thing was simply a mistake and curtailed it. Trump decided to exact a price from the Iranian regime and its terrorist militias because they've been fomenting violence across the region. They've been developing ballistic missiles, and they're doing illicit nuclear bomb development. The Trump administration struck at Iranian terrorist leaders and supported Israel's ongoing defensive strikes against Iranian military posts in Syria and elsewhere in our area. The Trump administration put Iran on a defensive, and this is quite different and in opposition to the Obama administration, which funded, through sanction relief, gargantuan growth in Iran's regional subversion and terrorism. So generally, overall, Trump made it clear that the United States would resist radical Islam and would partner with its natural allies in the region, which is Israel and the Gulf countries, plus Egypt. This was important pushback against the impression left by the Obama administration that America's interest may be to strengthen alliances with radical Islamic forces in the Middle East, like the Muslim Brotherhood and the Shiite regime of Iran. That's what the Obama administration did, even bringing billions of dollars in cash to pay Iran. I'm sure the listeners remember that. They paid off blackmail. Trump reversed all of that. And all of what I've said till now, especially the strong and firm hand shown to Palestinians in Iran over the course of the administration of Trump, this laid the foundation for an unbelievably rapid normalization treaties in 2020 between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. All of this was with the tacit approval of Saudi Arabia, something that was unheard of and would not have been dreamed of a year and a quarter ago. This regional reconciliation with Israel and all these countries is based on the sharing of a common heritage, and hopefully it'll prove to be the Trump administration's ultimate foreign policy legacy. History will properly credit the Trump administration with a Middle East strategy that brought about the beginning of the end of the Arab-Israel conflict. Scholars of diplomacy ultimately will acknowledge that the Trump administration, helped birth a dynamic that makes the Middle East and the entire Western world, and of course Israel, a brighter and more secure place to live. So all these people who didn't like Trump's personality simply don't have to invite him to dinner. But look what he's done as far as the Middle East and Israel is concerned. Nothing was done before since the existence of Israel. Nothing could have been expected like this even a year and a half ago. And here we are with the results of an unbelievable Trump policy that changed the Middle East from one end to the other. It's just completely different than it was before. And I think people must keep this in mind. I'll be back after the break.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
The beginning of this week, January 17th, was an anniversary. 30 years ago, on January 17th, the United States launched Operation Desert Storm to prevent what was happening in Kuwait. It had been invaded by Saddam Hussein's Iraq. He had invaded 5 months earlier. Saddam, true to his threats, responded to the United States military attack by launching missiles at Israel, and I remember this very well. In other words, the American President Bush attacked Iraq to free Kuwait on January 16th, and Iraq's response was to fire 8 Scud missiles the following night at Haifa and Tel Aviv. No one was directly killed by those 8 missiles, but in the ensuing 5 weeks, another 31 missiles were fired at Israel, and we sat in what we called safe rooms, and we taped up the windows. I remember this. We wore gas masks, and the windows were sealed with masking tape. And 2 Israelis were actually killed directly by the missiles. This marked the first time since 1948 that Israeli cities came under direct enemy attack. Not only did attacks traumatize the nation and make all its citizens, no matter how far from the front, feel vulnerable, it changed forever wars involving Israel in the Middle East. Up until then, Israel had fought 5 wars plus a war of attrition. The greater share of the battles of those wars took place at the front near the borders, away from the civilian population centers. Those wars were marked by tank battles in the Sinai or in the Golan Heights. The situation today is much different than it was then. This war was different because it's not our tanks against theirs on some desert plain. Rather, it was their missiles against our population centers, their rockets against our kindergartens, and every war or low-level conflict Israel has been engaged in since has followed the same pattern of that war. The enemy fires rockets, missiles, or bombs against Israel civilians. That type of warfare characterized what was called the Second Intifada back in September 2000. That was suicide bombers against buses and cafes and supermarkets. And 4 years, over 1,000 Israelis were killed. This type of warfare also characterized the Second Lebanon War in 2006. The Hezbollah fired nearly 4,000 rockets on Israel population centers. reaching as far south as Tiberias and killing 49 civilians. And this is also the type of warfare that the Jewish state has become accustomed to when fighting in Hamas in Gaza. They're firing thousands of rockets on Israel, cities and population centers. They shoot it at Sderot, Beersheba, Netivot, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Tel Aviv. And these attacks are not aimed at military installations. They are aimed at purely civilian targets. And the prototype for all of the above, which we're facing now, was the Scuds on Israel from Iraq and that war. One of Israel's strengths, and indeed one of the keys of Israel's survival, has been a keen ability to learn from bad times and difficult situations and to implement the lessons that we learn. For example, the 1991 Gulf War placed civilians directly in the line of fire and it caught the civilian population unprepared to deal with this type of situation. But the Scuds from Iraq and the notion that they could have been packed with chemical or biological weapons forced the Israeli army and the government to readjust to a new military reality. Home Front Command was set up in February 1992, making it responsible for civil defense legislation was also passed at that time. Now, for the first time in 1992, we had an agency of the Army responsible for civil defense. As the legislation was passed, requiring reinforced security rooms to be built in any new homes, any new apartment, and in public spaces. The intermittent rockets fired from Gaza over the last 15 years have shown that the country's civil defense has much room for improvement. But the situation today is far better than it was in 1991, when what protected homes and apartments from Iraqi missiles was masking tape on the windows. And I remember that very well. Now, even more importantly than the development of Home Front Command, the Gulf War's Scud attacks brought home to the country's decision makers the notion that some solutions need to be found to the rockets and missiles, and it was simply untenable to evacuate large population centers like we did back in that war. I remember cars lining up. People who had never been to Judea and Samaria suddenly felt safer there, and they left their homes in Tel Aviv to visit those areas that they were politically opposed to. It was sort of amusing. From that moment on, efforts to develop an anti-missile umbrella to protect Israel became a top priority, and it gained momentum. The Arrow Project, which was started some 5 years earlier as part of Ronald Reagan's Star Wars initiative, picked up both speed and advocates after the Gulf War. One of the reasons was because the Patriot anti-missile batteries the United States sent here proved rather ineffective, and Israel cannot afford to be left standing naked in the wake of any future missile attacks. Israel was helped enormously by generous U.S. funding, and Israel set its mind to developing a three-tiered anti-missile defense system. We're familiar with those names. First is the Arrow, to counter long-range ballistic missiles, like they could come from Iran. The second is David Sling, to deal with intermediate-range missiles that could come from Lebanon, and the Iron Dome to intercept short-range missiles coming from Gaza. That was very clever on the part of Israel to set up these three-stage defenses. This umbrella does not hermetically seal the country, and some rockets will obviously seep through, especially if thousands are fired simultaneously. Nevertheless, the technological achievement is tremendous, and something that gives the country a degree of maneuverability and maneuvering space and breathing room. And that technological achievement got a huge push from that night 30 years ago when the Iraqis thought that by firing Scuds at Israel they could provoke a response from then Prime Minister, who was Yitzhak Shamir. He thought the Americans told Israel not to respond, and apparently Iraqi Saddam Hussein thought that Israel could not hold on, would be forced to fire back, and that would break up the United States-led coalition, which included a number of Arab countries that were waging war against Iraq. So Shamir was very clever. He did not respond. He fired at Tel Aviv, and the missiles he fired at Tel Aviv and Haifa changed the face of war for Israel forever. We have a whole new and different philosophy of how to defend the country. As I said, a 3-level missile defense. It's not perfect, but it is very, very good. So Israel, one of Israel's strengths and one of the keys to our survival has been an ability to learn from bad times and from difficult situations, and those lessons that we learn are also implemented, and that is something that's very important. Our army and the defense forces and the government had to readjust to a new military reality, including, for example, the setting up the Home Front Command, which is now a major part of Israel's defense and particularly protecting the civilians. So it was 30 years ago this week, the day that Israel's wars changed forever. It's a whole new ball game, that's the proper word to use, since January 17, 1991. And thank God we have reacted properly and learned our lessons. And that's important. That is what keeps Israel safe. The ability to learn our lessons and implement what we've learned. I'll be back after the break.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany is but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. There is an organization here in Israel called B'Tselem. It was created back in 1989 during the first Intifada, and B'Tselem documents what it considers to be human rights abuses done by Israel in Judea, Samaria, East Jerusalem, and even Gaza. The head of the organization doesn't understand what his position is. And in a dramatic announcement last week, his organization declared Israel an apartheid state. And I quote, he said the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is governed by a single regime that works to maintain Jewish supremacy. In recent years, the Israeli regime has grown increasingly explicit regarding its Jewish supremacist ideology. Unquote. By the way, the very fact they use the word regime has a negative implication to it. So I want to say about this organization, which to the best of my knowledge is only composed of Jews. There may be some Arab members too. Now, Israel is definitely not an apartheid state. There is no apartheid inside Israel within the 1949 armistice lines, means the original Israel before the Six-Day War, when there are many Arabs living, nor is there any apartheid in the areas controlled by Israel beyond those lines, which Israel captured in 1967. To say that Israel is an apartheid state is either not to know Israel or not to know what apartheid is. Those using this term in relation to Israel are doing so not in an effort to truthfully describe a situation, but simply to malign and demonize Israel because of an obsessive hatred of the Jewish state, even if they live here. Apartheid describes a particularly grotesque form of institutionalized racism that existed in South Africa from 1948 to 1994 and was designed to preserve dominance of one race, the white race, over another race, the black race. Anyone who looks honestly at Israel on either side of the Green Line, the armistice line of 1949, knows this is simply not the situation here. Inside the Green Line, the original Israel before 1967, Israeli Arabs have full civil rights. Israel's aspiration, as laid out in its Declaration of Independence, is for equal rights between Jews and Arabs. The question is, has it reached that aspiration? No, not. It hasn't yet, but so has other countries like the United States not reached the goals that were originally established for it. But it's working toward it, and so is Israel. But it falls short of the aspirational ideal does not make it an apartheid or a racist society. Oh, the only thing it does is make it a society which is not yet perfect, just like the United States. It is equally absurd to use the term apartheid to describe the situation in Gaza or what's called the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. It's 15 years already, 16. Israel has had no say whatsoever in the governments in the Gaza Strip since then. Hamas violently took control of that place, the Gaza Strip, in 2007 and rules there with an iron fist. The Israeli naval blockade of Gaza, as well as the fence keeping Gazans from coming to Israel, is not meant to separate inferior Palestinians from superior Jews, as Israel haters would like to argue. The reason there is a fence there is to keep the terrorists who run Gaza from realizing their violent aims toward Israel, aims illustrated all the time when rockets are being fired from Gaza toward Ashdod. And in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is a self-governing body meant to govern the Palestinians until a final agreement on what to do with those territories. The fact that there is no final agreement is not the blame of Israel, it's a Palestinian fault. The security fence and checkpoints on the West Bank roads are not designed to perpetuate a regime where there is one race superior to another, but rather is protect Israeli citizens, including Arabs, from real-life terrorism. Anyone remotely acquainted with the Israeli-Arab conflict of the last century, and it is a century long, understands why we have a fence. It is because of this view that Israelis do not pay any attention at B'Tselem's pronouncements, believing them to be so far from the truth as to be irrelevant. The reason I bring this subject up at all, and not just to remind the listeners of the real history, but because the Director General of B'Tselem spoke at a Hebrew Reali school in Haifa at the beginning of the week, despite a ban on B'Tselem lectures ordered by Education Minister Gallant several months ago. Gallant, the education minister, issued a ban to block the entry of groups that, and I quote, contradict the goals of the education system, including calling Israel false, disparaging names, or opposing Israel as a Jewish, Zionist, and democratic state, or discouraging meaningful service in the Israeli army, or acting to harm or degrade IDF army soldiers during or after their service. Now, this is the law here in Israel. A law passed by the Knesset in 2018 allows the education minister to ban an organization that does not meet these criteria. It bans an organization like that for speaking, for example, in the schools here in Israel. B'Tselem called Israel an apartheid state for the first time since the group was founded 31 years ago. Up to now, it's been doing what they call documenting the way Israel behaves over the Green Line. But now they actually use the word apartheid state, and the word apartheid is a very emotionally charged word. The head of this organization, B'Tselem, he said Israel is not a democracy that has temporary occupation attached to it, is one regime from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and we must look at the full picture and see it for what it is, apartheid. Now, what happened was, although they're not, the B'Tselem is prohibited by the law here, prohibited by the education minister to speak at schools in Israel because it falls within the category of disparaging names and so forth against Israel. So they did speak at the Reali school in Haifa, and to defend inviting someone from B'Tselem to speak, the head of the school said, for many years we've exposed our students to a broad variety of opinions from across Israel's political spectrum. We respect the students' right to express their opinion, and we're proud of their involvement in issues at the heart of Israeli society. We hold respectful dialogues and intend to continue this tradition. In other words, the school invited an organization that essentially was prevented from speaking there. It should have been prevented by the education minister because it falls within a category of an organization that disparages Israel and calls it all kinds of names that are simply not true. It's a very, very bad thing, I think. I guess bad is the best word to use. Because the education minister instructed the school not to give a stage to an organization that makes a living from spreading lies and encouraging international pressures on Israel. The difference between a monitoring organization, a false propaganda organization, is like the difference between East and West. And if they don't differentiate and don't know when they're inviting a propaganda organization, the school, I think, made a big mistake. This has very rarely happened. And by the way, it's the first time this really anti-Israel organization used the word apartheid. So I wanted to call that to the attentions of the listeners who will probably hear a lot of propaganda about what happened in Haifa. Thanks again for listening.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.